Good morning to our audience in the US and good afternoon to our audience in Europe. My name is Amy Gans and I'm the Deputy Director of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, a program of the Aspen Institute, which convenes a diverse bipartisan group of leaders who share the goal of promoting evidence-based solutions to significant US economic challenges. We're pleased to partner on this event with the Aspen Institute Kyiv and Aspen International Partners. This is the 10th installment of Aspen Kyiv's Ukrainian dialogue series titled Defense of Freedom. Although our focus today is on Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction, I want to acknowledge at the outset that the war is still ongoing and the outcomes are far from certain. While we think it is important to start discussing now the many questions surrounding Ukraine's rebuilding, we also want to acknowledge the very real impact the war is having on Ukrainians, including our colleagues at the Aspen Institute Kyiv, who have been displaced from their homes and affected in numerous other ways. We are grateful to Yulia and her team for putting together this event, especially amidst all that is happening in their lives. With that, I want to introduce Yulia Tichkevska, Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Kyiv. Yulia previously served as Vice President at the Kyiv School of Economics and worked as head of the advisory group for the Ukrainian Minister of Economic Development and Trade. In 2018, she was on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list in Europe for her role in building Ukraine's civil society. Yulia, over to you.
Thank you, Amy. Dear friends, dear colleagues, dear participants, I'm honored to welcome you at this very important event. I'm grateful to the Aspen Institute and Aspen Economic Strategy Group for this excellent opportunity to address one of the most significantly important issues of nowadays. Aspen Institute Kyiv is one of 12 Aspen institutes around the world. Before the war started, we were working in Ukraine for more than a decade, promoting value-based leadership and providing a platform for Ukrainian leaders to conduct a dialogue on critical issues. As a whole Aspen family, we share our mission on building good society, free, just, and equitable. After the war started, we focused all our activities on contributing to Ukraine's victory. Today, we work with Aspen partners around the world, trying to reach out to their leadership communities to raise awareness of what is happening in Ukraine and to win more friends who will stand with Ukraine in this fight for values. We support our alumni who are playing a critical part today in Ukraine fighting for freedom in different fronts. We work on such complex topics like new social contract in Ukraine, wartime journalism, mental health, and others. It is a matter of fact that economy is a key factor for success in a war. As an economist by education, I understand the scale of harm and devastation that already affected Ukrainian economy. Thousands of businesses just vanished. Hundreds of enterprises were destroyed fully. Sea transportation blocked, to name just a few visible consequences. On the other hand, there are signs that inspire some optimism, like digitalized, effective banking, like resilient communications, like reliable and resilient as well agricultural sector, and others. Certainly, sanctions put on Russia are an effective tool for the containment of the aggressor, but now we see that Russia chooses war on attrition that may last months and maybe years. We always hope, we are optimistic and hope for Ukraine's victory soon, but understanding of this strategy brings a lot more economically sound issues beside only sanctions, in which context problems with Ukrainian grain is an evident example. It is clear that we should think about the economy more strategically. So I sincerely welcome our outstanding speakers, best economic mind of our times, who agreed to share their ideas and vision on how to deal with these future economic challenges, but also with new opportunities. Thank you, Amy. Thank you for having us here. Thank you.
Thank you, Yulia. Next, let me introduce our moderator, Bob Zelick, who is a member of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group. Bob wears many hats, including Senior Counselor at Brunswick Geopolitical and Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Bob served as president of the World Bank Group from 2007 to 2012. He was Deputy Secretary of State in the U.S. from 2005 to 2006, and he also served as the U.S. Trade Representative from 2001 to 2005. On behalf of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group's co-chairs, Hank Paulson and Timothy Geithner, thank you, Bob, for your leadership on this event. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Yulia and Amy, and thanks to Aspen and participants and all of you, especially our Ukrainian friends who are taking time in the midst of a crisis of a war to be with you. This is a particularly timely moment. There's a G7 summit that will be held later this month in Germany. And one of the other participants, Pascal Lamy, and I, years ago, were Sherpas for summits, so we have some sense of the need to have the countries prepare for what they were going to try to produce at the end of June. And I think this is an opportunity for the G7 to plan the next critical campaign of the Russian war on Ukraine. And that is the battle for Ukraine's economic survival, recovery, and reconstruction. As Yulia mentioned, we now face a war of attrition, and economic resilience will help determine the outcome. So we have two excellent panels over the course of 90 minutes. I'm going to introduce the participants on the first panel very quickly, and then ask each of them to make some opening comments about 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll try to have some questions and follow-up before going to the second panel. So first, I want to, in particular, thank the first Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Economic Developments and Trade, Yulia Svirodenko, for taking time to join us from Kiev. She was appointed to this position in November of last year. She had served as a deputy minister since 2020. In 2018, she was chair of a regional state administration, and she's been in the government since 2015 after being in the private sector and earning her master's degree at Kiev National University of Trade and Economics. So we're particularly grateful for her to take time amidst a wartime conflict. But I also then want to say she'll be followed by a very good friend of mine for many years, Natalie Jaresko. Natalie began her association with Ukraine formally in 1992. She's a Ukrainian American. We were at the State Department together, and she became the first chief of the economic section of our new U.S. Embassy in Kiev. And she stayed. She became the president of the Western newly Independent States Enterprise Fund, which is a government-sponsored private equity fund set up by the United States. She then co-founded her own fund, Horizon Capital, which was to focus on small and medium-sized businesses. And based on her extraordinary association, in 2014, the Ukrainian government suggested she might want to become finance minister. Her only problem was she didn't have Ukrainian citizenship. So they solved that by making her a dual citizen. She served until 2016 and was, frankly, a heroic leader of a reform program with the IMF and debt restructuring. After she stepped down, if that were not enough of a challenge, she became the executive director of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico, where she's now joining us. And she negotiated the exit from the largest municipal bankruptcy in the US. So for those of you that recall a little cultural history, there was a movie called Ghostbusters. It said, when you're in big financial trouble, who do you call? Well, you would call Natalie. And then I'll close with Pascal Lamy, who is at present president of the Paris Peace Forum. He was director, the head of the WTO for 2 terms. He was a European Trade Commissioner. And important for this event, and when I first met Pascal, he was the chief of staff to the president of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, during the end of Cold War and the dealings with Central and Eastern Europe, as well as being a friend of 30 years. So, Minister, why don't you start us off?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. First of all, thank you for being here, for having this opportunity to have this conversation. And actually, thank you for all these countries who support Ukraine, for all this free world that support Ukraine in this very dramatic times for us. So what I would like to start with that we think that actually this Russian aggression, Russian invasion to Ukraine is not war just against of democracy, not the war just against of some European common values that we all were sharing, but it's also war against of well-being of Ukraine, the war against prosperity of Ukraine. And we have two fronts. One is a military front where our army heroically defend our land, and we have economic front, the second one, where Ukraine fights against poverty, where we fight against low labor productivity, energy dependence, against we're fighting against the low GDP per capita. So to sustain the victory in this war, Ukraine needs to make, let's say, like a triple jump from the victim of aggression to the regional military power, from the Russian horde to the European Union, and from the, let's say, frontier economy to the developed country. So 3 months ago, I thought that we can make this triple jump, let's say, in one generation. Now it's obvious that we need to make this triple jump just in 1 decade. And you would ask what we can do to speed up and how we can grow threefold from 4,000 of GDP per capita to, let's say, 12,000 of GDP. I just look at numbers that Poland had. So first, our answer is a full membership of Ukraine to the EU. So we believe that the true security of Ukraine can be achieved only by economic, trade, energy integration to the EU. Second factor is the full access to the EU and G7 markets. So we think that EU and Canada lifted tariffs and quotas for the products that is made in Ukraine for at least 1 year. We acknowledge the first movements from the United States side that allows Ukrainian metals to enter United States markets, and of course we expect that G7 and EU government they will follow the example of Great Britain, and they open their markets, let's say, in the long run. So we will focus on development 5 key industries: energy security, food security, cybersecurity, green metallurgy, and the last one, maybe it sounds not so attractive, but it's very important military industry and space complex and aerospace industry. So let's say for military industry, we think that we should produce enough modern weapons to protect ourselves, and we insist that we're seeking to create joint venture with the NATO companies for technologies transfer and for the weapon supply to the NATO countries. Second is the food security. We will continue to expand our competitive advantage and enroll into the deeper processing of raw materials to increase money value of export. So I think that the problem of processing, the necessity of processing is vital for us, and not only because of the export value of processing goods, but also because of the fact that Yulia just mentioned on the beginning, in case if the seaports are going to be blocked, we need to find the way how to physically to decrease the export volume, but not to lose the volume of export itself. So our aim is to become top 5 exporters of worldwide, not by volume, but by export value, because by volume you might find in the statistics in the data information that we're like top 5, but if you look at the value of this export, we're just on the 22nd position and with the 3rd position. So for energy security, we will develop our nuclear plants, we will develop green energy, last week, we finished our full integration to the NSOE, and now we're able to export energy to the EU. So we are going to base on that. For the cybersecurity, we have a full potential to be the motherland for tens of next unicorns. We will help our IT outsourcers become product owners and develop through military tech and cybersecurity startup. So it's our main for the next few years. In green metallurgy, I think that it's a good chance for us to rebuild these destroyed plants and to build them based on a new base and expand both metal export volume and value to become one of world's top 10 metal exporters. To boost these 5 industries, we need to develop our 4 competitive advantage. First of all, is to win regional tax competition. Second thing is we need to ensure investors that they will be able to get cheap electricity in any amount needed. Third thing is we need to provide minerals, hydrocarbons and wood for further processing. And the first, I think it's very important and essential for all investors is a logistic issue, secure, fast logistic in Europe. So not longer than 72 hours. So we will build our economic development around the Green Deal. So Ukraine rebuilt as climate neutral with minimum carbon footprint. So for us, the challenge to rebuild Ukraine also provide the opportunity to become green. So all mentioned components, I think, in a combination with the resilience of Ukrainian business, in combination with bravery of Ukrainians and with persistence, so it's a good prerequisites for the development of our country. So what would need further in inflow of capital to our country? So I think that, of course, we need to look at the reconstruction of Ukraine, not only from the, let's say, from the point of view that it's a physical reconstruction, but it's also a good chance for us to build and rebuild Ukraine based on the new base, let's say like this. So we need to accomplish the much needed reforms to achieve the rule of law, to achieve the property right protections. So, and I think it's exactly why we should join EU. So in this case, we will adopt all the rules and laws that will help us to achieve these goals, and we expect that we will obtain the candidate status till the end of June, and we hope that we will obtain the EU membership in a few years. So our economic pledge to the EU and G7 countries is to provide their sovereign guarantees for the company originating from these countries to come to work to Ukraine. I think it's what we're thinking about, that these guarantees can cover the country risk of Ukraine and can cover military risk after war ends to speed up investment to Ukraine. Just if to estimate and you just calculate, I think that we expect that guarantee, such a governmental guarantee from our foreign partners' side, just 1% of their GDP for 10-year horizon can give us opportunity to attract investment to Ukraine. And the growth model where G7 and the EU government cover Ukrainian country risks with their sovereign guarantee granted to the company originating from this country should be actually win for both, for international partners and for Ukraine as well. So, and I will finish with a statement that we always tell to our staff in the ministry, that armies win battles and the economy wins wars. That's why we need our foreign partners to participate more actively in this recovery plan, and we're just working out right now this plan, and it will consist of two phases: early recovery and post-war recovery. And that's why I think that this platform, today's events, is also opportunity to apply to our foreign partners to play more actively in this procedure of working out this plan, because it's the future of our country, but it's the future of the Europe. So that's why I don't want to take more time. Thank you for this opportunity to talk, and glory to Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much, Minister. And that was a very concise and precise focus. We'll come back to some of those items, I hope. But I want to hear next from Natalie. And Natalie, you have the scars of fighting entrenched interests and corruption in the process of reform with Ukraine. I know you're very committed to the country's success and survival. But as you make your opening points, help us try to give what advice you would offer for Ukraine or its partners to try to overcome that past problem.
So thank you very much, Bob. I guess I would start with the fact that from 1991 to 2014, Ukraine had a very mixed history in terms of incomplete reforms. Progress was made, then they went backwards, and in many cases, this was caused by vested interests. And the vested interest stopped the reforms from going forward because they weren't in their interest. 2014 was a turning point for Ukraine. After the Revolution of Dignity, where the Ukrainian people stood up for these European values, for a way of life that was different than Russia's, and the initial invasion, let's not forget, began in February of 14, with the illegal annexation, occupation of Crimea, then Donbass. The Ukrainian government really started in 14 and over the last 7-8 years to move forward on the economic reforms that were necessary. So I'll kind of go back to that period and say some of the most critical things, which are going to be critical even going forward. One was fiscal restraint and moving from over 10% of GDP budget deficit to 2%, redirecting resources such that we were putting from then on at least 5% of our budget, 5% of our GDP into the national security. You see the outcome of that today. You see a military standing up to the second largest army in the world and doing it quite successfully. Fiscal decentralization, which was really important and doesn't get enough news. It doesn't get enough headline. We moved revenues down to local communities, and we moved revenues down so they wouldn't be coming hat in hand begging in Kyiv, as well as not encouraging corruption in that way. That fiscal decentralization created communities and regional leaders that you see today taking responsibility and acting without direction from above, without waiting for information, acting to both maintain the economy as well as defend the country. We got through that sovereign debt restructuring, which I think will be an issue that's going to come back in the future. And we started, and over the past 8 years, implemented a great number of institutional mechanisms to improve transparency, which did a couple things: improved efficiency, but also broke down some of the corruption. Those transparency elements were things like Prozoro, which is a procurement system, e-budgeting, which gave everyone in civil society visibility into what was being budgeted and how monies are being spent. And more recently, Gia, a mobile app that the government has introduced to provide services to individuals. You don't have to stand in line. You're not faced with having to provide bribes. All of these transparency elements have an anti-corruption element in them. And then lastly, banking reform was very successful in the last 8 years. We implemented strong regulation. We eliminated weak banks that had been taken advantage of by their owners. And what you see today is a very resilient banking system and a very professional central bank. So much of today's economic resilience in the face of this unbelievably destructive war is based on the reforms of these 8 years. And there are the lessons learned for the going forward. One, we need to keep doing what we did well, managing that deficit. Right now, as you can well imagine, with an almost 35 to 50% GDP contraction expected this year, the Ukrainian government is reliant on the United States and the EU to cover a substantial budget deficit. It's about $5 billion a month. And that means that they've got to manage that deficit. They're reliant on the Western support, the G7 support, and that support needs to keep coming. Primarily, it should be coming in grant form and not adding to the debt load. But managing that deficit is going to be critical going forward. Second, I would say that we need to strengthen what we didn't finish in these past 30 years. We didn't finish the work on anti-corruption. And that means the anti-monopoly, antitrust pieces of the puzzle that were not put in place, that were not implemented. We need to complete privatization and complete getting as much of the assets out of the hands of the state and or vested interests. And we need to finish with rule of law and judicial reform. All of these things are going to be critical to motivating donors and the private sector to come in and rebuild Ukraine. And when I think about rebuilding, I think of kind of three big pieces. One is Ukraine needs to inspire the world with its rebuilding plan, something that the minister just was doing with her description of meeting the challenges of a green climate, of energy efficiency, and of being a major part of the value-added food security problem and others. So inspire, an inspiring story and a story that inspires with its reforms as well as with its building strategy. The second big piece, the sources of capital. Well, I'm sure you're gonna have a second panel that talks about this, but where will the money come from? How will we motivate both the confiscation of Russian frozen assets to be used as part of this rebuilding, if not the bulk of the rebuilding, the G7, the international financial institutions, and finally, the private sector? What confidence building measures do we need to put in place for donors, for the private sector, and for Ukrainian society? Things like an improved procurement system. Prozoro is good, but it's not good enough for the massive amount of construction that's going to have to happen. So an agreed, transparent, monitored, audited procurement system will be one of those confidence building measures. The minister talked about sovereign guarantees of private investment. I'll just talk about political risk insurance provided by MIGA at the World Bank, as well as individual G7 governments. Critical. And I'll add to that given judicial reform is going to take time, even with the best of intentions and actions, there probably should be some kind of court set up with foreign judges operating on UK law, for example, that will provide an immediate source of confidence to the private sector that they have courts to go to that are fair and free. And then lastly, there's going to need to be a massive coordination amongst the different donors. One of the challenges I had as a government official back in 2014, when the world was at our side in Ukraine and supporting us, was that it wasn't well coordinated. And I, as a minister, had to manage, some 400 different conditions on each piece of funding that we received, and it was a mess from a coordination standpoint. So I would hope that we learned our lessons from that period of time, and we move forward with a more coordinated effort on the international side. I'll leave it at that and look forward to questions.
So, Pascal, some 250 years ago, your country helped finance our revolution until we had a guy named Alexander Hamilton who came in and played the role that the minister and Natalie played to sort of get our country on the right track, at least partially. So, from a broader European perspective, but also somebody who's worked so much with the Central and Eastern European countries in the reform process, what guidance or observations?
Well, thanks, Bob. And I've listened carefully to what we just heard, which I think gives us an element of response that I will build on. I'm not an expert in Ukraine, but I remember working very closely with the Ukrainian authorities from 2005 to 2008, when Ukraine became a member of the World Trade Organization. And I think I helped midwifing this complex process. And I just want to say that, knowing a bit of Ukraine at the time, I cannot not be impressed by the incredible change that have taken place during the last 15 years in this country, and which probably explain why we have this resilience, this capacity, which, let's be frank, has astonished a large part of the world in resisting this Russian invasion. Now, let me try and answer your question. Let's assume this war ends, which probably will come at the time where the Russian invasion will be clearly defeated. My view, for what it's worth, is that this moment should kick off a 10-year process, and I noticed that Yulia herself mentioned the name decade in her remarks, of what I would call RECO acts for reconstruction of the country and its accession to the European Union, which I see as two totally intertwined endeavors, processes that should go hand in hand. A Ukraine own reconstruction with a massive effort, mainly from EU and US, and this being embedded in its European accession process. Starting with the reconstruction, what I see is roughly a 300 to 500 billion financing package, sort of a Marshall Plan-like, which should be developed in 3 phases. Emergency, to start with. Second, restoration of destroyed infrastructures, and we know that, unfortunately, there's a lot of that ongoing. And 3, sort of new growth trajectory that would then put Ukraine on a normal path of development in this region of the world. A maximum of grants, a minimum of loans, plus guarantees, as already mentioned by Yulia, which are probably a modern way of providing the necessary support and confidence for economic operators, and a 2040 zero carbon target, which I think could be the sort of distinctive feature and backbone of such a recovery plan. That's for the side of reconstruction. On the side of accession to the EU, a step-by-step process of alignment of Ukraine to EU laws, regulations, values, which should start this year with step 1, which is the recognition that Ukraine is recognized, given the statute of a candidate, which in EU enlargement processes is always square one. Square one is whether or not EU countries recognize that Ukraine becomes a candidate, and then a process starts. So that's my very simple and sketchy answer to your question, Bob, and reaction to what both Yulia and Natalie have said. 3 questions to conclude these short introductory remarks. First, are the 27 EU countries ready to start this process, as well as, by the way, it should be the case for Moldova and Georgia? I think the first answer to this question is for the European Council 10 days from now, on 23rd and 24th of June. My guess is that the answer will be yes, but with a series of qualifications, parameters, which inevitably Ukraine will see as a sort of conditional yes, and maybe, and that's my expectation, as a 2 conditional yes, but I bet on a yes. Second question, can this huge and massive reconstruction endeavor be financed and by whom? Here again, my answer is yes, provided EU and US both emit with their AAA the necessary amount of debt. Expect, of course, in the future, burden sharing discussion between EU and US, and of course with other possible international partners, UK, Canada, Australia, Japan, and the rest. Third and last question, which takes us nearer to the operational side of the equation. What does the past tell us of what has worked and not worked? We have a series of examples. We have, of course, the Marshall Plan, which today would be roughly 400 billion euros. We have Iraq and Afghanistan, roughly 150 to 250 billion euros. We have the German Reunification, where roughly 300 billion euros were devoted to infrastructure, modernization, and rebuilding. So what does this tell? Marshall Plan was a success. Iraq, Afghanistan were not successes. The German Reunification was a sort of mishmash. Part of it succeeded, but another part obviously did not succeed, at least as quickly as was expected. And my advice on this is fits very well with the last point which Natalia made. I think what is needed is a single, strong coordination system with the necessary technocratic authority to move things on the ground. And in my view, this must be a sort of analog of what was put together with the Marshall Plan. At the time, it was called the Economic Cooperation Authority. We need such an authority, which should regroup, in my view, the EU Commission on the one side and the Ukrainian government on the other side. These should be the two in charge of coordinating both the reconstruction package and, which anyhow will be the case, the accession. And again, if I need to give a sort of time indication, I would say this is a 10-year navigation ahead of us. Of course, the sooner the better, but this goes without saying. Over to you.
Clear and efficient. Thank you very much. Minister, I want to come back to you. You kindly looked ahead, but those of us in public service know you have to get to the short term to get to the long term. So I want to make sure I understand what, in your view, is critical for Ukraine's economy to survive another year.
You mean in the short term? First of all, so in the short term, I just will say not from theoretical side, but from very practical side, what we're facing like a government, with what challenging we're facing with. First of all, we need to create the proper life conditions and to create a security condition to give the opportunity for our people that leave the country to return them back before the 1st of September. So it's a big challenge for us, and it's not only about, it's a security question, of course, it's the question of rebuilding of the social infrastructure that were destroyed. I mean, school, kindergartens, hospitals. And the third thing, it's let's say programs that provide to create a workplace for people, as the majority of them, they leave country because of the fact that their houses were destroyed, because of the fact that they lost their jobs. And now we need to, for those companies that were destroyed, we're trying to provide the proper loans to give them opportunity to rebuild the assets. And for those companies that are fully destroyed, and for those employees that are lost their works, now it's a big challenge for Ukrainian government to provide the proper conditions and to provide the proper programs. We just think that it's going to discuss with the president that it's going to be grant programs from the governmental side for starting business, for creating the proper conditions for SMEs, as we want to create like thousands of small and medium enterprises, and we want it to be the basic base of Ukrainian economy. So I think that the big challenges for us, it's for those business that were operational before war, and to provide them proper conditions to start operation again, loans first of all, grants, and for those people that for this company that are fully destroyed, just to provide conditions for people to find the proper work place.
So that was very helpful. One quick follow-up. You, as is appropriate with Ukraine these days, you emphasize the things you're doing for yourself. What would be your estimate of international support that you would need, say, per month to get through to the next year? I've heard numbers of about $5 to $6 billion. I think Natalie talked about that. Is that
Yes.
a fair estimate?
Yes, I think Natalia just mentioned it in her speech, $5 billion per month to cover our expenditures in that necessary amount that will give us opportunity actually to survive and to keep fighting.
Okay, so Natalie, you've been in these posts, and you know, the minister's got like 25 items on her desk, each one is marked urgent, and you've realized in those jobs you have to set priorities. So there's a huge amount to do. What advice would you give to the Ukrainian government on top priorities over the next few months?
So I think number one is to coordinate the initial macro financial stability effort with the international community. I think we talk a lot about rebuilding, which is a large and necessary component of the future. But I'm worried about this $5 billion, $6 billion a month. And I think spending is increasing from what the minister just described with grant programs for the economy. So I would be looking to either negotiate a basic IMF program to serve as the baseline, and or a longer term negotiation with the G7 and the EU about satisfying this urgent financial issue. I think right now, the United States and the EU have committed 3 months worth of support, and that isn't enough. And I believe that this is going to have to come with some reforms, although I understand this is not a time for massive economic reform implementation, but I think there needs to be a dialogue with the donors to ensure that they know that continues, that some of the things that perhaps stopped during the war period will restart. For example, using Prozoro for certain purchasing. That transparency could restart again. So I think there are elements that the government can put forward as an effort to build confidence. But I don't like the idea of Putin waiting us out, that the United States moves into an election period. People think that they've finished their job. There is an urgent necessity right now, obviously on the military side in terms of supply of weapons, that goes without question. But on the second is a more medium, I'll call it medium term, meaning a year's worth of planning for the international community to support the basic economy.
So Pascal, as always, your 3 questions that you posed yourself were probably the same questions I would have posed to you. But let me press on one that's relevant to this. Like you and like Natalie, I think it's very important to have the analogy to the ECA and the Marshall Plan, one coordinating agency to work with Ukrainians. The poor Ukrainian team is going to be stretched from hither to yon if they've got to work with World Bank, EBRD, European Commission, EIB. They'll never have time to do anything real. What's the chance that Europe would be, as you know, the European Commission's first inclination will be, we can handle this. But what's the likelihood that Europe, and will get the support of the US and others, to create a standalone body to help coordinate this?
I think the odds are high, not least because there will need to be some sort of burden sharing. But let me insist on the fact that this has to be.
Sorry.
Let me insist on the fact that I think that this needs to be very much Ukrainian owned. This has to be owned by the Ukrainian people, by Ukraine as a country. And so I would hesitate to give a definitive answer to your question before knowing what the position of the Ukrainian government is. But I think you definitely need something We did something of this kind, if you remember well, after the fall of the Berlin Wall with Eastern and Central Europe, which I didn't mention in my examples because the level of the financial package was not in the same proportion. But I think the center should be EU Commission and Ukrainian government, and then around this, some sort of participation. And we have, for instance, the EBRD, who has a governance structure, which already includes quite a number of actors. Last remark, listening to what was just said, short term, I totally agree that short term comes before long term. But I also believe that starting to frame the size and the content of a 10-year plan for Ukraine would help credibilizing short-term steps. So I don't think it's either or, but I think the lesson of history is that this sort of thing works better when it is preconceived before the end of the war. And one critique, which was done to the Marshall Plan, and you are, as a big fan of history, Bob, remember that, the Marshall Plan only started in 48 to 52. And if one critique must be done to the Marshall Plan, which on other side was the most successful experience, but that it started a bit too late. It could have been probably more efficient if it has been sort of within the sort of between Yalta and the end of the war. So, I mean, I'm a real advocate of trying to examine such a thing right now, and preferably within a structure like the G7, which probably is politically speaking the best face of what such a club and authority could do.
So learning from history, people will want to note that based on that delay of the Marshall Plan, my boss, James Baker, worked with Pascal's boss, Delors, at the July 1989 French G7 summit to set up the G24, which was our idea that we believe the European Commission and community needed to look east. And it was fortunately shared by Delors and Lamy. So we're going to move to the second panel, but we're going to come back to some of these themes that you've raised, which I think we've brought all of them. So I hope you can stay with us. But I want to draw in some additional perspectives. First, we've got Timothy Ash, who's a senior sovereign strategist from Blue Bay Asset Management. He's an associate fellow at Chatham House. He's been researching and writing about Ukraine and Russia for over 30 years. He holds various university posts, advised government, but we're particularly pleased that he will add, we hope, the investor perspective. Then we'll be joined by Sergey Garyv, who is a professor of economics and director of the graduate program at Sciences Po in Paris. He was the chief economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. He was the rector of the New Economics School in Moscow from 2004 and 2013. He's had many posts, but the one that we were particularly pleased that he could join us was that he was a member of a task force of Center for European Policy Research that did an excellent report on Ukrainian recovery and reconstruction, touching on a number of the items we had in the first panel. And then he'll be followed by Ben Steele, who is the Director of International Economics at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is the author of the very best books on the Marshall Plan and the Bretton Woods institutions, the creation of the IMF. And he soon got a biography on Henry Wallace, who people may not recall, but was Franklin Roosevelt's vice president, almost president, Secretary of Agriculture and Commerce, and would have changed the course of history, as Ben's book will point out when it comes out. But so, Timothy, why don't you start us off?
Great. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'll be very quick and jump through some points. But firstly, and it's probably not been mentioned, but you know, compared to our position on February 24th, what is clear is Ukraine will exist. I mean, there is going to be a country left after this war, a significant part of the country, hopefully all of it, will be in Ukrainian hands. And I think it will be successful. I mean, the innovation that Ukrainians have shown defending their country against overwhelming odds. For me, it's kind of a state of Israel moment, right? The country's proven its ability to survive. The population's proven their innovation, and I think that innovation will carry on when there is a peace. And I think it's about capturing that and helping it. And I think the other point that has kind of been mentioned, but maybe we need to be a bit more specific. If you look at the history of emerging Europe and you look at Ukraine's position in the last 30 years, what is crystal clear is countries that have made the successful transition have had a clear EU accession perspective, right? The blueprint of reform provided by Copenhagen in '94 was critical for places like Poland and Hungary to develop. And Ukraine has never really had that. So I think, we need to stop beating around the bush and get on with it and give them this clear perspective. God damn it, they deserve it. They have fought and died for European values. I think they know more about European values than many of us do. So I think that's really, really important. The fourth point, and we again kind of skirted around the issue a bit, but there's no point talking about the long-term plan and Marshall Plan, etc., unless we finance Ukraine's survival in the near term, and we're not. The 5 billion has been mentioned, the monthly budget financing needs. Ukraine's been getting 2. And it's been meeting 3 from central bank financing, basically, monetary emission. And the cost of that has been they've lost about 10 billion of reserves. So reserves have gone from about 30 to 20. They were in a very good starting position. And it's not good enough. I mean, the European Union has promised up to 9 billion euros in the 40 billion US plan. There's 8.5 billion. I think a lot of that will be dispersed this year. And I think the critical factor here is that US money are grants, free money, not free because Ukrainians are dying on our behalf. The EU money is credit, it's loans. So Ukrainians, unfortunately, are paying for fighting our war for them. The result of that, likely, is at the end of the year, Ukraine will have a debt GDP ratio of something like 100%, right? So, there's all this debate about sanctions on Russia and OFAC, forcing Russia into default. It's not a win, in my mind, if because of, of provision of debt to Ukraine, they end up in an unsustainable position from a debt perspective and end up in a default. That's an info war loss. And I don't think that can be allowed to happen. So we need to disperse money far more quickly, and there needs to be more grants. And the EU, I think, needs to pull its finger out and be more active there. I guess the issue is going to be, if we move longer term, the issue is going to be who pays. That's going to be politically pretty challenging. Big numbers mentioned. But we can't, ignore the elephant in the room, which is there's plenty of money out there, and it's the frozen central bank reserves, and it's the frozen other Russian assets that probably around 400 billion. So there's plenty of money there. It's a complicated issue. There are legal issues, but this is such an extraordinary event. This is such an extraordinary attack on Western liberal market democracy. Putin has crossed all the kind of norms and standards that we have to change laws to make sure this happens. Because if this money is not used to pay for the reconstruction, Western taxpayers will have to, and that's going to be very, very challenged politically. And probably it's not going to happen. So the money's there. We need to change the laws. We need to just get it done. And I think what's interesting in this conflict is that many things that we thought could never happen in terms of sanctions, CBR asset freezes, for example, SWIFT sanctions, kicking Russia out of various investment indices, actually got done. So, with political will, they can get done. And again, going back to this idea, if we do not do this, Western taxpayers will have to do it, and there will be a political price for that. So, I would say that has to be done. And then burden sharing. I guess I was invited here as a representative of the private sector. And I noticed Mr. Lamy was talking about burden sharing between the US and Europe. Nothing was mentioned about the public and private sector. If we end up with a debt GDP ratio 100% at year end, there will be talk about debt relief inevitably. I would argue, what about let's maybe think innovatively. Let's maybe not think about default and debt restructuring. Let's push the private sector to put new money on the table, actually, and partner up with the official sector, viewing this recovery and regeneration program as a wonderful opportunity for private business to get involved. And if you think of the big banks, the JP Morgans, Morgan Stanleys, Deutsche Banks, HSBC, all these banks, this is about, as Jamie Dimon, the JP Morgan CEO said, I mean, this is an attack on our system by Putin. It's about the survival of our system of governance. And I think they should have an interest in investing in that through Ukraine. And I think we should be already challenging them and telling them that, if you believe in ESG, which is central to everything we do in the private sector at the moment, then this is the number one ESG, well, not the number one, climate change. I would argue, well, it's out there. It's as big as climate change. I would argue they need to get involved in that. And maybe linking, the final point from me, maybe linking the frozen Russian assets, debt sustainability, etc. Maybe we need to think a little bit innovatively in terms of these frozen assets. And okay, assuming that the legal changes that will be required will take some time, what about as an interim measure, Western governments pledging to lock those frozen assets as collateral to underpin Ukrainian debt? Essentially, if you think, Ukraine started this war with a 50% debt GDP ratio. If they end up with 100%, how about saying we'll cap the stock at public debt at 50%? The other 50% we'll earmark some of those frozen Russian assets to cover that, so Ukraine's creditworthiness remains where it was pre-war, and we'll guarantee that we'll sort the legal out, and eventually those assets will be freed to be used as fully as collateral, but the interim will cover that. And again, it's this idea of who pays and making sure that Ukraine doesn't end up paying a huge cost and burden in addition to the military and human cost. It shouldn't have to bear the financial cost of this war because they are fighting it on our behalf. So anyway, I'll end there. Cheers, guys.
So thanks, Timothy, in particular for introducing the idea of some innovative public-private financing. And you make a good point. The news and the financial world is full of ESG. Well, if Ukraine is able to actually rebuild its production infrastructure, as Pascal and the minister mentioned, with the no carbon sort of prospect, that's the E. The G, this is as big a governance story as you could find, and it's all about sustainability and social aspects. So ESG funds are looking to make sure they meet SEC standards. Maybe this is a good part. Sergey, again, I just want to compliment you. Pascal mentioned this too. The CEPR report is by far the best I've seen. Thank you for it. So what would you like to emphasize?
Thank you very much, Bob, for inviting me. That's been a fascinating panel, including the first part, and greatly thank the participants in the first panel. But I fully agree with what Pascal has said, and indeed it's completely consistent with what we wrote in that CEPR report, where I should say we had a group of 8 people, including 2 Ukrainian economists, the president of Kyiv School of Economics, Timofey Milovanov, and Berkeley professor Yuri Gorodnichenko, and 2 former IMF chief economists, I should say as well. But overall, all the things that Pascal has mentioned are consistent with our report. A specialized air agency, co-ownership of this agency with the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian people, and European Commission, the grants rather than loans, and so on and so forth. Now, a couple of things I would emphasize, which kind of came up a bit later. One thing is the relationship between Reconstruction, this specialized agency, and European accession. So as a former chief economist of EBRD, I can tell you it's very hard to set up sunset institutions. EBRD was supposed to close down when transition is over. A lot of countries have completed their transition. EBRD is still prospering, working hard, not closed down. And the same is, by the way, with OECD, which grew up out of the agency supporting the Marshall Plan. OECD is still alive and kicking. So one of the things which therefore teaches policymakers about agencies like the Economic Cooperation Agency administering the Marshall Plan is not to set up new agencies. And this is what Bob has raised, to what extent international organizations, governments would be happy to see a new agency being created. And our response to that is, if you have admission process, this agency stops functioning exactly when Ukraine joins the EU. This is going to be a long process, probably a decade, but at least you have a sunset clause right away, because the accession process has a clear ending point, and you can actually codify that in the existence of the agency. The other thing I would mention, and this has happened after our report, Bob has asked the question to what extent Europe would agree to this. Now, a month later, so our report came out on April 8th. On May 18, a month later, European Commission published the communication on relief and reconstruction of Ukraine. That's where some of this money mentioned today appeared. Short-term help to Ukrainian budget. But there is also half of the paper which talks about reconstruction. Some of the ideas there are also consistent with our views. And most importantly, there is not an agency, but a platform. We don't know what the difference between platform and agency is, but platform is designed exactly like we discussed. It's a tool to coordinate donors' efforts. It's also something that has to be supported and co-owned by Ukrainian government, and eventually it has to be mostly managed by European Commission. Now, the autonomy of the platform of the Commission is a key issue here. And then that will determine to what extent non-European donors would be excited about this initiative. And most importantly, to what extent America, United States will be happy to provide resources to an agency if this agency is too dependent on the European Commission. So these are the issues. Another issue, and this is something that Tim has been talking about, is who pays. So in our paper, and this is where I'm being the only Russian on the team, was very happy to put it in, is eventually Ukraine will get its reparations paid. It could be a long process, could be suing Russia, which will take time, but Russia is responsible for all this destruction, and Russia will have to pay reparations. And unlike the previous episodes and examples, including those that Pascal has mentioned, but also the story of Iraq attacking Kuwait, for example, when you have to impose taxes on Iraq oil revenues. This time around, it's much easier. You don't need to tax future revenues of Russia because you already have Russian assets frozen. And it could be a long-term process where Ukraine sues Russia and waits until the reparations are awarded, and only then uses these amounts of money. Or, as Tim has suggested, this could be used as collateral, and so on and so forth. But I think eventually we all know that in the end of this long judiciary process, Russia will have to pay Ukraine for all this destruction, and of course, these frozen assets will be fully or partially used to pay for the disaster. Now, let me say a few words very quickly. Our session is our second panel is called Consequences: Global Economic, Geoeconomic, and Political and Strategical Consequences of this War. I would say that we cannot forget, and we should not forget, what Yulia was talking about: blockade of Ukrainian ports and the weaponization of grain crisis. I think this is something that really, really scares me. Of course, Ukrainian tragedy is first the tragedy of Ukrainian people. Russia is also suffering, but another problem is not just the fact that European consumers are paying higher prices for food and energy, but also the developing countries. And that includes, of course, the Middle East and North Africa, the most important importers of grain from Russia and Ukraine. And the Russian government is quite openly talking about this crisis as the threat for Europe. The closest confidant of Mr. Putin, the Secretary of Security Council and former KGB chief Nikolai Patrushev, openly said a month ago that a grain crisis will result in grain shortages and higher bread prices in southern and eastern Mediterranean. Europe will get a huge wave of immigrants and refugees, and we will see if Europe is able to survive that. And so they're quite open about weaponizing this crisis. And I think this is something that we should worry about. We should prepare ourselves and help these countries to survive this shock. And of course, make every possible effort to unblock Ukrainian ports. My understanding is that it can be done. Turkey is an important player in this. But eventually, this is something that we should bear in mind. This is a huge, huge threat to global stability, but also to European unity. Not to replay what happened 10 years ago and 7 years ago. That's been a very important political shock for Europe. Let me stop here.
So I just wanted, particularly for the audience, draw out 2 points that Sergey has made. We've talked somewhat about the emergency needs, and we've talked somewhat about the reconstruction. I think one of the real contributions of the CEPR report is also paying attention to the critical infrastructure and services. And the minister touched on this. So again, just to give a reference point, minister would have a better feeling. But of a population of roughly maybe 40 million, there's some question about that. You've had about 16 million people, either refugees or internally displaced. It's really hard to run an economy if people don't have basic shelter, if they don't have the basic ability to return to their communities and start jobs. And I think the report highlighted the need for a special attention to those sort of basic emergency services. And the second one, in drawing attention to the Black Sea, I think there's the initial question about food supplies, which will be critical for the rest of the world. But I think there will also be importance in realizing the future of Ukraine's economic geography. Those of us that worked with trade economics or others know the importance of economic geography. One person won a Nobel Prize for this. And I think this is going to be an important part of all the fightings in the East, what comes out of the Black Sea arrangements. So Ben, you're the historian of the Marshall Plan. What's applicable? What isn't?
Well, I'd preface my observations, Bob, by saying that I strongly support generous U.S. and Western humanitarian and reconstruction aid for Ukraine. But to your point, geography is absolutely critical. Geography and security. So going back to the Marshall Plan, I think that particular historical analogy is not helpful in these circumstances because of geography and challenges of security. If we go back to the 2-year run-up to the Marshall Plan, the United States committed many billions of dollars comparable to the annual allocations under the Marshall Plan to rehabilitation aid for Europe through the new UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA. And in terms of achieving US geopolitical goals, the UNRWA aid was distinctly unsuccessful. And geography was the primary reason. Stalin was able to undermine the sovereignty and independence of all his new satellite nations, as he called them, in Eastern and Central Europe. Communist Czechoslovakia shot down 2 UN relief planes flying over its territory. And this was an important reason why, in 1948, the United States decided that it would have to bring its reconstruction aid for Europe completely in-house, as it were, that would be the only way to guarantee that its larger geopolitical aims were met. And it is not an accident that the Marshall Plan aid wound up being focused overwhelmingly on Western Europe and not on Eastern and Central Europe. Marshall aid was made available in principle to all of Europe, but Stalin insisted that the Central and Eastern European countries, those which he occupied or on whose borders he had hundreds of thousands of troops, he insisted that those governments would not participate in the Marshall Plan. Now, one particular government, Czechoslovakia, which was a legitimate coalition government at the time, small d Democrats and capital C communists, didn't quite get the message and kept trying to find a way to participate in the Marshall Plan. And Stalin made his views absolutely clear in February of 1948 when he instigated a communist coup in the country specifically to prevent Czechoslovakia's participation in the Marshall Plan. So in the end, the Marshall Plan wound up being focused on Western Europe because of geography, because those were countries that could be protected, defended against Soviet aggression. But even then, the countries of Western Europe, in particular Britain and France, insisted on ironclad US security guarantees in order to participate in the US agenda for integrating Western Europe economically. It's fascinating that this idea was actually one that came from the State Department. They insisted that the US provide ironclad security guarantees, and these came in the form of NATO's Article 5. NATO was constituted a year and a day after the Marshall Aid legislation was passed. So NATO comes into existence in April of 1949. And I argue in my book that those security guarantees were absolutely critical to the rapid revival of domestic private investment and foreign investment in Western Europe, which drove Western Europe's very rapid recovery after the institution of Marshall Aid. Now, if we look at recent examples where the US has tried to use massive reconstruction aid as a means of achieving its geopolitical aims, they've been distinct failures. Pascal Lamy mentioned Iraq and Afghanistan. We spent $210 billion on reconstruction aid alone in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's $50 billion more than the current dollar value of all Marshall aid to all the 16 countries after World War II. And we have almost nothing to show for it. And the primary reason is that we failed in the end to provide sufficient internal and external security to Iraq and Afghanistan. And without that security, there was really never any prospect of transformative economic policy. So how do we apply this in the case of Ukraine? Well, we can't control geography. Ukraine does border Russia. Russia has made absolutely clear that the most vital element in Ukraine's security going forward, which would be to join NATO, is completely unacceptable to it. Keeping Ukraine from joining NATO is in fact a central Russian war aim. So we have to be realistic about any reconstruction aid that we would provide Ukraine. It will not have the sort of transformative economic and political effects that Marshall Plan aid had without some basic form of cooperation from Russia, or at least committed non-interference. Now, obviously, the best possible result of this conflict would be that Ukraine would be entirely liberated, that President Putin would be disposed. But even in that case, we are highly, highly, highly unlikely to have a pro-Western Russian government that would support political and security integration of Ukraine into Western Europe and the wider Western sphere. And this is why I think the Marshall Plan analogy is not helpful. It builds up expectations and it minimizes the focus that we need to put on security.
We have a minute. I'm going to try to come back to a few quick questions. And Ben, let me just start with you. So you and I are probably in total agreement that anytime somebody wants to spend large sums of funds, they put out a Marshall Plan, and the history suggests that they're missing many of the other aspects. You properly focus on the critical role of security. But beyond that, are there lessons to be learned, for example, the integration with the EU point that a number of speakers have mentioned? As you know, that was one of the driving pieces of US logic behind the Marshall Plan. We were ahead of European Union before the Europeans. The notion of a standalone agency, the ECA experience, and frankly, sort of grants versus loans. So do you think that if one deals with the security issue, I realize a big if, are there some aspects of the Marshall Plan that we can learn from?
Yes, but again, they're really quite limited. We did have a very robust conditionality framework in the Marshall Plan, but it really only worked to a limited extent. We had separate ECA, Economic Cooperation Administration offices in each of the Marshall Plan countries. And so I won't go into all the details about how the Marshall Plan funding worked. It was an extremely complicated mechanism called counterpart funds, where each country took responsibility for framing its own reconstruction effort, but where the United States would have some form of veto power through its local ECA office. But in the case of France and Italy, both governments recognized very well that they could pretty much do what they wanted because the United States had only one overriding geopolitical priority, and that was keeping the Communist Party in France and Italy from coming back into government. And so the US was really constantly at loggerheads with the Italian and French governments, which were each pursuing very different policies for reconstruction. And in the end, the French and the Italians pretty much did as they wished, but it really didn't make a huge difference, Bob. And that was because these were already developed countries with a long history of relatively independent, competent, expert civil services that were capable of implementing a long-term vision for economic reconstruction. Could they have done better if they had followed a US blueprint? Perhaps, but both of them recovered. In both cases, we achieved our aim, so it really wasn't terribly important. In the case of Ukraine, we are not simply trying to revive a structure that existed before the war, but we are still in the process of trying to encourage the creation of a truly independent, competent, non-corrupt civil service with the sort of cooperation of the private sector that we haven't yet seen in Western Europe. So that would be a major challenge.
So Timothy, let me just come back to you. You've been doing this for 30 years in the region, the wider region. You've seen what has been important for private investors. What's most important to reestablish private investor interest in Ukraine after a post-emergency period?
Well, security has been mentioned already, and I would certainly agree with that. I mean, but then again, after 14, 15, and 7 years of war, even before February 24th, investors were still invested. They were making investments in Ukraine. I guess key and maybe different this time is, Russia is attacking all over Ukraine, right? I mean, I guess the period from 14 to February 24th was, Russia contained its attacks largely to Donbass, and obviously it had Crimea, or took Crimea, and then the rest was of cyber attacks. So, but I mean, for investors, it's an end to the conflict, an end to the conflict and the perception of escalation, right? That's important. But actually, just going back to what Ben said, I mean, I'm just wondering a little bit. You mentioned Iraq, you mentioned Afghanistan. I mean, it's a little bit different this time around in my mind, because I mean, then the US was I used the word, and the UK was, I used the word invading. I mean, it was basically, certainly, well, it was invading two countries where a large sections of the population didn't want it, right? I mean, they didn't want intervention. It was trying to impose our system of government on two countries that, again, many of the people in the countries didn't want them, which maybe would explain why the Iraq reconstruction didn't go particularly well. I think in Ukraine's case, which is absolutely crystal clear, the population do want a different system. They want our system. They don't want what Putin was trying to offer them, right? So I would suggest perhaps reconstruction money spent in Ukraine would perhaps be a little bit more effective.
Okay, so some good questions here. And one point that we've really drawn out is the critical aspect of security. But Timothy, Ben, and frankly, from the first panel, emphasized the importance of Ukrainian ownership and how that will work forward. Because we're nearing the end, I want to try to just summarize some points here and also draw a few other international connections, which Sergey was already starting to do. But again, what I would, as a former policymaker, I hope that the G7, as it focuses on the economic summit, can address this in a serious way. I think that could be one of the most important messages coming out of the G7. So let me summarize with these points. One, a clear statement on emergency and reconstruction would send an important signal to the Ukrainian people. These people have suffered a huge amount. This is a question of morale and hope, but also managing expectations, as Ben said. Second, I think it could be a signal to Moscow. It's one thing to have military strength go head-to-head in artillery fire. It's another thing to have Russia's economic strength against that of the G7. I don't think that's going to turn out so well for Moscow. Third, if we reach this point of negotiating a settlement, assistance might ease that process. Fourth, drawing from Sergey's point, and others have mentioned this, Pascal, I think it's very important to focus on distinct phases, but see how they interact. If I'd had more time, I would have asked Sergey to tell us a little bit more about sort of the overlap. But important, this survival phase. The $5 to $6 billion a month, best if it's in grants, make sure you deliver the money. And as Natalie emphasized, the critical role of macro stability. This is for any country in this situation. If you lose that, you lose everything. But then also the fast recovery stage, then reconstruction. To make it work, there's also been a key message, and Natalie and the minister both emphasized this, the critical steps Ukraine has to start to take. Corruption, transparency, accountability, procurement, and maybe even a special court system originally to start out. Fifth, the point of the future relationship with the European Union. Whatever those Americans often don't recognize the complexity of what belonging to the European Union amounts to in the thousands of pages. But I think the key point at this point is it's important for the integration of infrastructure, of standards, of supply chains, and future foreign direct investment. Sixth, the question we've touched on is how will this be coordinated? The World Bank, in many cases, used to try to coordinate different agencies. You've got so many different players that can be helpful, but I do think there needs to be some system to try to pull this together, working with the Ukrainians. And frankly, I think the EU would be a natural sort of locus of that, whether platform or agency. I agree with Sergey and in a sense, Ben, it's nice if you can try to put a sort of a sunset date in this. Yes, the OECD came out of ECA, but it's a different type of organization. I mean, so if there's a policy and analytical tool that comes out of it, that's okay. Seventh, forms of assistance. We've talked about grants or loans. I think Timothy has opened up a door to trying to think of innovative public-private arrangements. We've talked about risk insurance of different forms. Eighth, critical need to integrate the economics and the geopolitics. This is rarely done. Ben Steele's books tend to do this better than anybody else. We've talked about the Black Sea, both the near term and for future economic geography, an eye on Moldova and Georgia. The G7 is not the G77, and Sergey raised this point. If you look at the votes in the UN, you see a lot of abstaining countries. Their interests are pretty different in Africa, Mideast, Asia, Latin America. They're concerned about food and energy. They're concerned about COVID, the cost of climate, debt, and now rising interest rates, resilience. And there's a big danger, in my view, if the G7 decides to help Ukraine but ignores the global South, because the message will be, well, the G7 will help people that look like it. It won't help the rest of the world. And that would not be a constructive step forward. A little sub-question. Since China stood on the sidelines, maybe if the Ukraine is being able to be sustainable and successful, maybe one should approach China to see whether it's willing to contribute in a constructive way. Ninth, we didn't touch on this, but I know that some of you have worked on this. I think there'll be a lot of studies on the sanctions experience. Sergey mentioned the reserves, but there's also technology, export controls, people, self-sanctioning. And then the last point, which a few of you and Sergey had mentioned, Timothy mentioned, I think we're going to need a sharper debate on the transfer of Russian reserves under both international and domestic law. In some ways, if done effectively, this could be a counterattack on Russia. And without getting into all the details, I'll just say that my former colleague and friend Phil Zelick at the University of Virginia has written an excellent piece on this in Lawfare. He certainly convinced me that under international law, there's a basis. And I can assure you, after talking to some members of Congress, if there's any doubt under US law, which I don't think there should be, it wouldn't take long to fix it. So we've got a few minutes left. Minister, why don't I give you a chance to make any of your closing comments if you're still with us? Do we have the minister? Julia.
No, I'm with you.
Okay.
I'm here.
Okay.
Actually, it was for me. It was interesting. That's why I stayed with you. And
I just thought we only have a few minutes left, but I think it'd be proper to allow you to make any closing comments.
Actually, it was for me. I'm like working, on the ground. That's why for me it was very useful. Listen actually to I perceived them like advice. So for the macroeconomic stability, absolutely agree with Natalia, and was all our speakers that raised the questions. It's very important, and now it's essential that for all our financial system and operating in the proper way, and we still keep this macroeconomic stability, and it's a vital. Another thing that yes, we understand it perfectly well that. Actually, I just jumped many thoughts. That's why I jumped from one thought to another one. Yes, we started this blueprint that you mentioned, and we discussed it internally with our ministries inside of Cabinet Ministry of Ukraine. And we also think that it might be some fund. It should be separate. Probably it should be like made from European Union side, and the main idea, but it should be transparent. But we still have this internal discussion how it should be operated and how we are going to manage it. And or in parallel, yes, we agree that we should launch and finalize all the reform that you mentioned, anti-corruption, judicial reform, and Natalia, we agree with you that we should return back our ProZorro system to provide all this transparent procurement to pass all this procurement procedure in a transparent way to persuade our partners. And I absolutely agree that we should give the perspective of how Ukraine is going to develop further to ensure them that, let's say, their financial aid that we are asking right now, and we mentioned this, it's $5 billion per month, are going to be spent in a proper way. And yes, another thing that yes, we're thinking about resources about that should go for recovery, and it both Ukrainian businesses and taxpayers, it's European business and taxpayer, but we also think about the frozen assets and about this, let's say, judicial construction that can provide us opportunity to get these frozen assets and to direct them for recovery and for providing the reconstruction of Ukraine. So it's just small, different thoughts that cover different topics, but in general, it's my feedback.
So, Minister, let me thank you. Let me thank all the participants. I think we've introduced this topic in an important way. I hope at an important time in the battle for Ukraine. I think one of the other themes is the critical need to integrate the security and the economic aspects together. People on this call have all been part of that. I just want to say, Minister, and for Yulia with Aspen, Ukraine, I speaking for everybody, I think the courage, the fortitude, the heroism of people in Ukraine has been an inspiration around the world. Words aren't enough for you, particularly now that you're battling artillery, but maybe in a small way, it just helps you know what a message it sent about the people of Ukraine to the world. So I want to thank you for that. So, Amy, anything else? It's 11, we're just hit the 2-hour mark or the 90-minute mark. Anything else, or should we close? Well, hearing none. I thank all of you very much, and I hope we have a chance to reestablish this in a short time when we come back and figure out what should be done next. Thank you.